What if your job wasn't just about surveillance, but survival? In the haunting corridors of Monarch Heights, one security guard's ordinary night shift turns into a nightmare. Join James as he uncovers a terrifying truth, one that traps souls in an endless cycle of horror. This is no ordinary haunted building. This is Monarch Heights, and you're next. James had always been a man of simplicity, his life rooted in the mundane routines that barely kept him afloat. A night security guard at Monarch Heights, a colossal, decaying skyscraper that once symbolized prosperity, James didn't give much thought to its haunted reputation. The building's ominous past, a history filled with whispered rumors of vanishing, strange happenings and eerie encounters, did little to stir his curiosity. To him, it was just another job, a paycheck that helped cover rent and buy him enough time to figure out what to do with his unremarkable existence. At 29, he was beginning to feel the weight of a life stuck in neutral. He'd dropped out of college years ago, chasing a dream that fizzled out before it even took shape. Now he spent his nights patrolling the deserted corridors of Monarch Heights, a high-rise that had been vacant for the better part of a decade. The company that hired him was barely functional, and the only other person James had ever seen was the day shift supervisor, an elderly man named Frank, who'd told him the usual. "Don't worry, kid. You'll get used to the quiet." Frank's words seemed almost prophetic as James stood alone in the lifeless lobby that first night. He had been assigned to the graveyard shift, a shift that would see him alone, wandering the empty halls, guarding nothing but dust and shadows. As the night wore on, the clock ticking relentlessly, James found himself admiring the oppressive silence. The old building creaked, settling into its own age, its walls lined with the scars of past lives lived in the once glamorous offices. He had the run of the place, free to roam and let his thoughts wander as his body stayed rooted to its endless surveillance tasks. In the dim glow of the security monitors, the building appeared almost regal, as if in its prime. Monarch Heights had been a marvel of luxury. Now, however, it felt like a mausoleum, empty, abandoned, forgotten. The vast lobby with its marble floors and towering ceilings seemed like a shell of its former self. Each hallway, long and silent, stretched into the void, amplifying the feeling of isolation. James passed the rows of elevators, the flickering lights casting unsettling shadows that danced across the walls. The smell of mildew hung in the air and dust settled like a blanket over everything, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. He paused at a window to look out over the city. It was well past midnight, the streets below bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, the occasional car passing by. The city was alive, but James, high above it all, was detached. He felt small. He felt invisible. This was his life now, a monotonous, endless loop of long nights spent in this forgotten place, where time seemed to crawl. But what James didn't know, as he leaned against the cold glass and stared out into the dark expanse, was that he was on the precipice of a nightmare. Monarch Heights, for all its emptiness, was not truly empty. Something lingered in the air, something old and malevolent, something that would soon make itself known to James, but for now, the building whispered nothing. It waited. As James turned to continue his rounds, he heard a faint creak from above, a sound so subtle, so fleeting, that he might have imagined it. But he didn't. He paused, listened. The building was awake, it seemed, and something in the silence told him in that instant that his nights here would no longer be the same. James had always found solace in the stillness of his nightly routine. The world outside the thick glass windows of Monarch Heights faded into the backdrop, and all that mattered was the hum of the building's ancient systems and the soft shuffle of his boots against the cold marble floors. It was predictable, reliable, or so he thought. On his first night alone, the silence took on a new, unsettling quality. As the clock neared 2 a.m., a chill began to settle in the air, one that crept beneath his jacket and tugged at the base of his spine. He paused near the elevators, staring into the emptiness as if the building were watching him back. But he shook it off, a trick of his tired mind, perhaps, or just the natural oddities of an old structure settling in the dead of night. Then he heard it. At first, it was almost imperceptible, just a soft, far-off murmur. James stopped in his tracks, his heartbeat quickening as he strained to listen. It wasn't the usual hum of the building's machinery, nor was it the wind rattling the windows. It was a voice. A faint whisper like a distant murmur through a thick fog slipping into his ears. He looked around, but there was no one. Just the hollow, empty spaces of the building. The air, thick and stale, seemed to grow heavier around him. "Just my mind playing tricks," he muttered, trying to shake off the unease crawling along his skin. His gaze drifted to the far end of the hallway, where the light flickered like a dying candle. The whisper returned, this time clearer, louder, but still distant. It sounded almost like words, but they were too faint to make out. James's brow furrowed. He continued down the hallway, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that someone or something was watching him. But as he turned the corner, the whispering grew more distinct. No longer a faint murmur, but a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate the walls. His breath caught in his throat as the temperature dropped noticeably, the chill sinking deeper into his bones. "Who's there?" he called, his voice thin and uncertain in the vast emptiness of the building. He knew the answer before it left his lips. No one. The whisper seemed to answer, coming from the shadows just beyond the reach of the flickering light. It wasn't a voice anymore. It was something more organic, a hiss, like a breath being drawn too close. Then a word, barely audible but unmistakable. "James." The blood in his veins turned to ice. He froze. His mind raced, trying to rationalize the situation. He was alone. There was no one in the building with him. It was just the building, its creaks and groans, the loneliness of its hollowed-out halls. But the air felt thick now, suffocating. And the whisper came again, closer this time, like a breath at his ear. "James." The voice seemed to come from the shadows directly behind him. And in that moment he knew he wasn't alone, heart pounding. James turned around, but there was nothing. Just the long, dim corridor stretching into the void. But the air had changed. It was heavier now, colder, as though the very walls of Monarch Heights were closing in around him. The whispering stopped, but the feeling remained, clawing at him like invisible fingers brushing his neck. He glanced back at the security monitors, half expecting to see something, anything that could explain what was happening. But the screens were static. The usual flicker of lights in the empty halls now seemed to mirror the uncertainty twisting in his gut. He leaned against the cold metal of the elevator shaft, trying to steady his breath. Maybe it was just the stress, maybe it was exhaustion catching up with him. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The building was alive, and it knew he was there. And for the first time, James felt a creeping terror that he couldn't explain. He took a deep breath and tried to dismiss the panic rising in his chest. He wasn't some supernatural victim. He was just a guard, a man doing his job. But then the whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Get out." It wasn't a plea. It was a command. His heart hammered in his chest as the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. James spun on his heel, but again there was nothing. Just the eerie quiet of Monarch Heights, stretching endlessly before him, as if daring him to turn another corner. But this time, he didn't feel alone. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder over the next few nights, like an invisible presence stalking James through the endless hallways of Monarch Heights. Despite his rational mind, which clung desperately to explanations like faulty wiring or the building's age, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something more than just the unsettling atmosphere of the abandoned skyscraper. Unable to ignore the nagging dread, James started to dig deeper into the building's history. It was during one of his late-night patrols, when the building was blanketed in its usual oppressive quiet, that he made his first discovery. The security office, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the basement, contained a dusty archive of files, logs, and old maintenance reports that no one had bothered to look at in years. James hadn't meant to search through the old documents, but the whispering and his growing sense of unease led him to it. The smell of mildew and decaying paper was thick in the air as he pulled open the creaky filing cabinet, its rusted metal groaning in protest. The file folders inside were yellowed and brittle, their edges frayed with age. He flipped through them, scanning the headings, looking for anything that could explain the strange occurrences. That's when he saw it. A file labeled "Incident Reports Missing Guards" caught his eye. His breath caught in his throat as he pulled it out, fingers trembling slightly as he flipped it open. The file contained a list of names, several former security guards who had worked at Monarch Heights before him. The names, dates, and a few lines of incident reports filled the pages. But what caught his attention was the unsettling consistency in the details. All of them had gone missing during their shifts, vanishing without a trace, and each disappearance seemed to coincide with the same eerie events that James had been experiencing. James scanned the reports, his pulse quickening as the weight of the situation settled on him. It wasn't just one or two guards, it was a string of disappearances over the course of years. But what truly disturbed him were the details in the final entries. In each case, the last known location of the missing guards was traced to the very hallways he now walked every night. The familiar, cold corridors, the flickering lights, and the whispered voices. The same events had preceded the guards' disappearances. His mind raced. Could this be a coincidence? No. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled as he read further. There was more. In a hastily scrawled note at the bottom of one report, someone had written, "The guard who went missing last week looked too much like the others, like he was becoming one of them." James frowned, flipping through the pages until he reached the most recent case. The entry was dated just a few months before he started working at Monarch Heights. It was a detailed report of the disappearance of a guard named Michael Larson. James read through the entry, which described the guard's last night on duty. The report mentioned strange noises, cold spots, and Larson's growing paranoia before his final transmission over the radio. "I'm not alone here. Someone's watching me. Please send help." The rest of the entry was blank, as if the report had been hastily cut off. The unease that had been bubbling inside James now surged into full-blown terror. Something was very wrong here. These weren't just the disappearances of random workers. The guards, all of them, had vanished under eerily similar circumstances. Each of them had experienced the same terrifying events, just like James. But the real shock came when he turned the page to find a photograph of Michael Larson, the last guard to go missing. It was a standard ID photo, the kind that all employees had taken when they started working. James's eyes widened as he stared at it. Michael Larson didn't just look like him, he was him. The features were almost identical. The same brown eyes, the same worn expression, even the same stubble along his jaw. It was like looking into a mirror, only with a different face. James felt his stomach twist into knots as the realization began to settle in. Was this some kind of sick joke? No, it couldn't be. He stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity. He flipped back through the file, his breath quickening, his mind spinning. How many other guards had looked like him? How many of them had shared his appearance, his traits? The eerie sensation that had been gnawing at him since his first night in the building now felt like a lead weight pressing down on his chest. His thoughts raced back to the whispers, the voice that had called his name. Had the building been watching him all along? Was this fate? Had he somehow been drawn to Monarch Heights for a reason he couldn't yet understand? The sudden sound of a creak, like the groan of an old wooden floor, brought him back to the present. His heart skipped a beat and he quickly snapped the file shut, looking up. The silence in the basement was suffocating, but the unease in the pit of his stomach told him that it was more than just a sense of paranoia. Something was coming for him, just as it had come for the others, and it was only a matter of time before the building would claim him too. The discovery in the basement had shaken James to his core, but the real terror was just beginning. As he left the security office, the weight of the file he'd just read pressed down on him. A heavy, suffocating presence that seemed to follow him through the dark, empty hallways of Monarch Heights. The whispers, still faint but persistent, seemed to grow louder in his ears, mingling with the sound of his own footsteps echoing off the marble floors. It was as though the building itself was alive, watching him, waiting. James tried to shake the feeling off. His rational mind kept telling him that it was just the stress, the isolation, the uncertainty of working in such a vast, desolate place. But deep inside, something gnawed at him, a primal fear that he couldn't explain. He had always thought that ghosts were mere stories, the stuff of folklore and campfire tales. But now he wasn't so sure. Monarch Heights was no ordinary building, and he was no ordinary security guard. As he continued his rounds, the building seemed to shift around him. The flickering lights and strange noises became more frequent, more deliberate, as if the place itself was trying to communicate. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. It was nearly 3:20 a.m. when the phone rang. James had just passed the security desk when the shrill sound of the ringing phone cut through the silence. He froze, instinctively glancing around as if the sound itself might have some hidden meaning. It was strange, no one ever called. The building's phone system hadn't been in use for years, not since the last tenants left. He had only used the phone once to confirm his shift schedule when he first arrived. But now it was ringing. James stepped cautiously toward the desk, the hairs on the back of his neck standing at attention. He hesitated for a moment, then picked up the receiver. His voice came out hoarse, a mix of uncertainty and suspicion. "Hello?" For a moment there was only static on the line, the kind of buzz that felt thick and unnatural, like the phone line itself was trying to resist transmitting a clear signal. James's grip tightened on the receiver and he leaned in closer, listening for any sound, any hint of what could be causing the disturbance, and then, through the static, he heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable, a voice that chilled him to his core. James. The name was soft, drawn out, but it was his name, unmistakably his. He pulled the phone away from his ear for a moment, staring at the receiver as if it might somehow offer an explanation. The voice had been distorted, warped by the static, but it was still clear enough to send a shiver down his spine. He swallowed hard, his throat tight with unease. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice trembling despite his attempts to sound confident. "Who is this?" For a moment there was only silence, and James thought maybe the call had dropped. Maybe it was just a prank. But then the voice returned, this time louder, more urgent yet still distorted by the static. "You're next." The word sent a jolt of panic through James's chest. His pulse hammered in his ears as his hand trembled, the phone now feeling like a foreign object in his grip. The voice was cold, flat, almost as if it were coming from something or someone dead. He couldn't place it, but the tone was unmistakable, a warning. He pulled the phone away from his ear, his heart racing. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't some sick joke. Someone was in the building with him. Before he could speak again, the line went dead, the click of the phone returning to its eerie silence. James stood there, staring at the receiver in his hand, his mind reeling. The building was empty, he knew that. He was the only one here. Yet the call had come from within the very walls of Monarch Heights. His mind spun with impossible questions. Who would do this? How? The answer gnawed at him, lingering just out of reach. With trembling hands, he checked the phone's caller ID. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but what he saw sent his stomach plummeting. The call had come from within the building. His heart skipped a beat. He didn't understand. The phone system had been disconnected for years, hadn't it? The idea that someone could be in the building, someone who was watching him, suddenly felt all too real. James looked around, his eyes darting down the dark corridors, his breath shallow as the weight of the moment settled in. The phone call was no longer just a strange occurrence, it was a sign, a message, and he knew without a shadow of a doubt that he wasn't alone. But who or what was calling him, and why had they chosen to reach out now? A cold chill wrapped around him, and the whispers in the halls seemed to answer his unspoken question. They were louder now, more insistent, like they were mocking him. James, the voice from the phone had been a warning. But what exactly had it been warning him about? Whatever it was clear that the building was not just haunted, it was alive, and it wanted him. And now, the game had begun. James could no longer escape the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the strange noises or the whispers following him through the cold, desolate halls of Monarch Heights. It wasn't just the phone call, a cryptic warning that had sent chills through his veins. It was something deeper, something primal, gnawing at the very edges of his mind. The building had changed. And so had he. As the days stretched into nights, the line between waking and sleeping began to blur. At first, it was just the odd sense of déjà vu. Familiar corridors, strange flickers of light. But soon it escalated into something far more terrifying. The nightmares started. At first they were just dreams, fleeting images, half-formed shadows. But they grew stronger, more vivid, more real. James couldn't remember when it had started, but he knew one thing for certain. These weren't ordinary nightmares. They weren't the kind of dreams that faded away with the dawn. They were becoming real, too real. Crawling into his waking moments, twisting reality until he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Each night the dreams grew more detailed, more vivid. He would find himself walking through the empty hallways of Monarch Heights, his footsteps echoing off the cold, polished floors. The place was always the same. The vast lobby, the tall windows overlooking the city, the endless rows of abandoned offices. But it was also wrong. The air was thick with an unseen presence. The shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive. And then he would see them. The other guards. They were always there, standing in the periphery of his vision, watching him from the corners of the dark rooms. Their faces were blurred like ghosts, but their eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, were the only part of them that seemed real. They didn't speak, didn't move, just watched him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. One night, the dream shifted. He was in the elevator shaft, the metal doors creaking as they closed behind him. The building felt darker now, more menacing. The walls were closing in, the air thick with the scent of mildew and rot. The elevator descended, but instead of stopping at the lobby, it plummeted deeper into the bowels of the building. The lights flickered above him, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. Suddenly, the elevator jolted to a stop. The doors slid open, revealing a dark hallway stretching into nothingness. And at the end of that hallway, standing motionless, was a figure, the figure of the former manager, the ghostly presence that had begun haunting his waking hours as much as his dreams. The manager's face was a mask of anger, twisted and distorted by time and hate. But there was something else in his eyes, something malevolent. "Something ancient. Why are you here?" James asked, his voice trembling as he stepped forward. The manager didn't answer. Instead, his eyes locked onto James, a smile playing across his face that wasn't a smile at all. It was a smirk, a twisted grin full of malice. Then, without warning, the figure lunged at him and the world around him seemed to dissolve. James awoke with a start, gasping for breath, his body drenched in sweat. The cold night air felt like ice against his skin. He was in his security office, staring at the blinking security monitors. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed loudly in his ears. He looked around the room, half expecting to see the figure standing in the corner, but the office was empty, just as it should be. Yet, something wasn't right. The feeling of dread, of being watched, lingered in the air like smoke. As James tried to steady his breath, he realized the true horror of what had just happened. The nightmare he had just experienced wasn't just a dream, it was a memory. The same elevator, the same hallway. He had walked those very halls the previous night. The building was feeding on him. And as the hours ticked by, the nightmares didn't let up. They followed him into his waking life, slipping between the cracks of reality and dreams. Every time he closed his eyes, the figures appeared. The other guards. The manager. Their eyes locked on him with silent accusation, as if they knew exactly what was coming next. James began to feel like a marionette, pulled and twisted by unseen strings, trapped in a nightmarish loop that he couldn't escape. The more he tried to resist, the more the building seemed to demand his attention. Every sound, every whisper, every flickering light, it was all part of the same horrible puzzle. And he, the newest guard, was now the missing piece. But the worst part was the dreams were changing him. He could feel it. The faces of the missing guards, once ghostly shadows, now felt like familiar faces. He could see their pain, their terror, their desperation. He could feel it in his bones, a deep-rooted fear that spoke directly to him, a fear he couldn't ignore. They had died in this place, and now it was his turn. As he stared at the monitors, his reflection in the glass seemed to warp, like the image was not his own. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the vision, but the face staring back at him was gaunt, hollow-eyed, like something else was wearing his skin. The whispers returned, louder this time, ringing in his ears, carrying the chilling sound of a voice he recognized. "You're one of us now." James, the line between nightmare and reality had disappeared, and James realized with horrifying clarity that he was losing himself bit by bit, dream by dream. The building was slowly claiming him, just as it had claimed all the others before him. It was only a matter of time before the nightmare would become his new reality, and the true horror was that he didn't know if he would ever wake up again. James had been bracing for something, but nothing could have prepared him for the terror that followed. The nightmares had been relentless. Each night they grew more vivid, more terrifying. But tonight was different. Tonight, James could feel the building's sinister presence creeping closer. Not just in his dreams, but in his waking hours. The air in the hallways had thickened, and the once familiar sounds of creaking floors and flickering lights now seemed to whisper directly to him. Monarch Heights was no longer just a haunted building. It had become a living, breathing entity, and it was drawing him in. He had just finished his rounds, walking the now familiar corridors when it happened. He had turned the corner toward the main lobby when a sudden chill hit him, biting into his skin like icy fingers. He paused, feeling a cold breeze where none should have been. The lights overhead buzzed ominously, flickering erratically, and then he heard it. A soft dragging sound. Like footsteps. James turned slowly, scanning the hallway. It was empty, just the shadows stretching long across the floor, distorted by the flickering light. But there, at the far end of the hallway, he saw something. A figure. The sight froze him in place. The figure was tall, its face obscured by the shadows. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though it were aware of James's presence but not in a hurry to acknowledge it. The chill in the air grew thicker, the temperature dropping rapidly, and James could see his breath in front of him. The figure continued its slow, agonizing approach, its footsteps heavy as if each step was dragging something unseen behind it. And then, the voice came. James. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was deep, low, and unmistakably human. The sound reverberated off the walls, and James's heart skipped a beat. The voice wasn't like the others he'd heard in the building, faint, distant whispers. This was a voice that came from somewhere very real, from somewhere close. The figure stepped into the dim light, and James's blood ran cold. It was the former manager. The ghostly figure was draped in an old-fashioned suit, the fabric dark and worn, its edges frayed like it had been there for decades, but it was the face that made James's stomach twist in fear. It was pale, almost gray, the skin drawn tight over the bones, and the eyes. Those eyes were hollow black pits, like they'd been gouged out and replaced with something darker. There was a grim smile on the figure's face, but it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was cruel, predatory. "You've been expecting me, haven't you?" The manager's voice dripped with malice as he took another slow step forward. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the hall, filling the empty space with an ominous rhythm. James stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. He had seen the manager's face before, his photo buried deep in the security records. But this was no photo. This was a real presence, a spirit or something worse. "What do you want from me?" James's voice cracked, but the words felt weak, lost against the overwhelming weight of the manager's presence. The manager's smile twisted into something darker, something more sinister. "You're part of the cycle now," he said, his voice low and rasping, "just like the others before you. You'll join us whether you want to or not." James felt a cold wave of nausea wash over him. The building, Monarch Heights, wasn't just haunted by the spirits of the missing guards. It was feeding off them, trapping them, and now it wanted him too. The former manager stepped closer, his movements unnaturally slow, like a predator savoring its prey. "This building feeds off fear, James, and you, my dear boy, are full of it." The floor beneath James's feet groaned as if the building itself was shifting, closing in on him. The walls seemed to constrict, the shadows lengthening and curling around him like living things. His vision blurred, and for a moment he wasn't sure if he was still standing in the hallway or if he was trapped in one of his nightmares. "You're no longer a guard," the manager continued, his voice cutting through the mounting dread. "You're part of the building now. Just like the others. You'll never leave. You'll never escape." James's pulse raced as he struggled to breathe, but his legs felt like they were frozen in place. He wanted to run, wanted to scream, but his body refused to obey. The manager's figure seemed to grow, looming larger, the black pits of his eyes absorbing the light around him. "Welcome to your new home," the manager's voice hissed, the smile on his face stretching impossibly wide. "Monarch Heights has claimed you." James wanted to scream, to fight back, but he couldn't. The building was alive. It was feeding on him, slowly consuming him, drawing him into the same dark, endless cycle it had trapped the others in. The more he tried to resist, the more the building squeezed its grip around him. The manager's laugh echoed in the hallway, deep and hollow, a sound that seemed to resonate with the very walls of the building. It was the laugh of someone who had long ago given up on life, who had become a part of something far darker than death itself. And in that moment, James realized the full scope of his fate. He wasn't just a security guard in an abandoned building. He was a prisoner, a pawn in a game that had been going on for far too long. The ghost of the former manager stepped forward once more, and James could feel the weight of the building's power pressing down on him. He had become part of the darkness that lingered in every corner, every shadow, And as the manager's cold, hollow eyes locked onto his, James understood. He was now just another lost soul trapped in the never-ending cycle of Monarch Heights. James's mind felt like it was unraveling. His thoughts tangled in a web of fear and confusion. The encounter with the manager's ghost had left him breathless, paralyzed with terror. He had thought the nightmares would be the worst of it, but the true horror was much worse. The building had a life of its own, a malevolent, all-consuming presence that dragged him deeper into its grasp with each passing moment. It was as if Monarch Heights had become an extension of his own mind, warped, disorienting, and unpredictable. No matter how many times James turned the corner, the hallways seemed to stretch farther, the rooms larger, the shadows darker. The corridors, which once seemed like a maze of old office spaces, now felt like they were alive, shifting and rearranging themselves as if the building itself were toying with him. James had tried to leave. He had tried to find the exit, to break free of the building's grip. But each time he reached for the door, it was as if the building was one step ahead of him. The walls pressed in, the doors were locked, and the layout of the building seemed to shift around him, as if mocking his every attempt to escape. His steps grew frantic, his breath shallow, but no matter which path he took, he found himself circling back to the same place. It was always the same. The cold, dark lobby, the empty elevators, the empty hallways stretching endlessly into nothingness. Monarch Heights wasn't just a building, it was a labyrinth. And James was its prey. It happened on the third night after the encounter with the manager's ghost. James was pacing through the corridors, his mind a blur of panic and disbelief, when he noticed something strange. The hallways were no longer familiar. The walls had changed. The wallpaper, once peeling and worn, now looked fresh, almost new. The floorboards creaked differently beneath his feet. The air smelled strange, like it had been scrubbed clean of the dust that had settled there for years. The atmosphere had shifted, as if the building had somehow reset itself. He stepped into what he thought was the east wing, only to find that the doors were different. The locks on them were newer, sleeker, as if they had been installed just days ago. He felt his stomach twist as he tried to turn the knob, but the door refused to budge. The hallway behind him seemed to stretch further now, the dim lighting casting long, disorienting shadows that danced against the walls. His heart pounded as he backed away from the door, realizing something far worse than the manager's ghost was at play here. The building was changing around him, warping its structure like a living thing. He wasn't just trapped in a building that was haunted. He was trapped in a place that actively sought to keep him there. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered violently, and the unmistakable sound of a door slamming echoed from the distance, though James couldn't pinpoint the source. It was as if the building had been listening, responding to his every move. The flicker of the lights, now more erratic, illuminated a path he hadn't seen before, an exit that had never existed before. A door at the end of the hallway where no door had been earlier. Without thinking, driven by the primal urge to flee, James rushed toward the door. His steps grew heavier, the air growing colder with each stride, as though the temperature had dropped by several degrees. His breath came in shallow gasps as he reached the door and grabbed the handle. The door swung open with an unsettling creak, and James stumbled through it, his heart pounding in his ears. He was in another part of the building, but this place was darker, more oppressive. The walls here were lined with old wooden paneling, the floors covered in a layer of thick dust, as though no one had walked through these halls in decades. James tried to steady his breathing, his pulse racing as he looked around. He was standing in what appeared to be a long-forgotten wing of Monarch Heights, its windows sealed shut, and its rooms covered in cobwebs and decay. But there was something else, something more sinister about this part of the building. The air was thicker here, suffocating, and the silence was deafening. A deep gnawing sensation settled in the pit of James's stomach. The whispers were louder here, echoing off the walls as if they were coming from within the very fabric of the building itself. And then, just as he thought he could take no more, he saw something move at the end of the hallway. A shadow. A figure standing motionless, its back turned to him. James froze, his breath caught in his throat. He knew that figure. It was the manager. The ghostly figure stood at the far end of the hallway, his back to James, but it didn't take long for the manager to turn around, his hollow eyes locking onto James's with a piercing gaze, his mouth twisted into that same cruel smile. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" The manager's voice rang through the air, low and mocking. James's legs felt weak beneath him, his mind spiraling into panic. He had to get out. He had to escape. But the labyrinth had already begun to close in around him. The walls seemed to press against him from all sides, the hallway growing smaller, the shadows deeper. He turned to run, but the corridor ahead of him was gone. There was no escape. He had no idea where he was anymore. The layout of Monarch Heights had changed again, and this time he couldn't make sense of it. The building was toying with him, manipulating him, pulling him deeper into its dark, endless maze. He kept running, but no matter how many corners he turned, he couldn't escape. Every hallway looked the same. Every door led him back to where he started. The maze was closing in on him, and he was trapped inside it. James realized then that Monarch Heights wasn't just a haunted building. It was a prison, an inescapable trap designed to hold him, to make him its next victim. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape. The building had already claimed him. The weight of the building's relentless presence pressed against James's chest, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into the nightmare that had become his reality. Each turn, each door he opened, led him further into the labyrinth that Monarch Heights had transformed into. He was no longer sure what was real and what was part of the building's cruel game. The more he tried to break free, the tighter the grip of the building seemed to become. The ghost of the former manager had stopped chasing him for now, but James could feel the cold, malicious energy of his presence lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting. The walls closed in on him, the air thick with the smell of decay and rot. The once elegant hallways, now consumed by dust and shadows, seemed to stretch on forever, as if the building itself had swallowed time, leaving him trapped in an endless, looping nightmare. James had wandered for what felt like hours, but in this place time had lost all meaning. He stumbled into what appeared to be an old conference room, its walls lined with cracked glass panels, the furnishings long abandoned. As he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him, locking with a deafening click. James's breath hitched, panic bubbling up from deep within. The room was dark, save for the flickering light from a single weak bulb above him. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting and curling like living things. He turned to the center of the room and froze. There, sitting at the long conference table, were the figures of several men. Guards, but not just any guards. These were the lost ones, the ones whose faces he had seen in the old case files. They were all there, but their bodies were twisted, their eyes vacant, like they had been drained of life and left to decay in the shadows. James's heart raced as he approached, his legs moving of their own accord, his feet heavy with dread. He recognized their uniforms, the same ones he wore. But the men's faces were gaunt and hollow, their bodies emaciated. They looked like ghosts, trapped in some kind of limbo. Their eyes followed him, but they didn't speak. Their mouths remained frozen in silent screams, as if they had been waiting for him to arrive. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, and James felt a presence behind him. He spun around, and there, standing at the far end of the room, was the manager. His smile was wider now, almost impossibly so, his eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. "You see, James," the manager's voice was soft, like a whisper, but it echoed in James's ears, vibrating through the walls. "You're not the first. You won't be the last." James's breath caught in his throat as the truth began to unfurl in his mind. This wasn't just a haunted building. Monarch Heights wasn't some random place where the spirits of the dead lingered. It was a trap, a prison designed to feed on fear, to consume the souls of those who entered. The building itself was alive, a malignant entity that twisted and reshaped reality to hold its victims in an endless cycle of terror. "You think you're special?" the manager continued, stepping closer. His face, once human, now seemed to blur and distort like a mask wearing away. "But you're not. You're just the latest in a long line of guards who have come and gone. All of them, just like you, trapped in the cycle. Trapped by the building." James's mind spun, the words cutting through the fog of terror that had enveloped him. "What do you mean?" he choked out. "What cycle?" The manager's smile grew even wider, the skin around his mouth pulling grotesquely. "You see, James, Monarch Heights doesn't just claim your body. It claims your soul. You will become part of the building just like the others, trapped in its halls, reliving your worst fears, your death over and over again forever." The other guards, those hollow-eyed souls, stared at him, their vacant expressions now filled with something darker, something more knowing. They weren't just victims. They were part of the building, trapped in an endless loop of terror, unable to escape. Each one of them had been claimed by Monarch Heights, and now it was his turn. "You'll never leave," the manager hissed. "The building owns you now." James's knees buckled, the truth sinking in like a knife in his gut. The building had always been more than just a place. It was a living entity, feeding on fear and trapping those unlucky enough to cross its threshold. The ghosts weren't just victims. They were the building's prisoners, forced to relive their deaths in an eternal cycle of torment. And now, James understood the worst part. He wasn't just a security guard in a haunted building. He was a part of it, destined to become one of the lost souls who had come before him. He could feel the pull of the building, a cold magnetic force drawing him in. It was as if his very being was being absorbed by the walls, the floors, the shadows. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His body felt heavy, as if the building itself was consuming him. His vision blurred as the walls seemed to close in, and he staggered backward, his mind whirling. But the manager wasn't done. The ghost's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he whispered one final bone-chilling truth. "You will join us, James. You'll be the next guard, and when the next poor soul comes through those doors, you will be here, waiting for them, just like we were." As the last of his strength ebbed away, James collapsed to his knees, his mind slipping away into the darkness. The building had won, and he was no longer a man. He was a part of Monarch Heights, an unwilling prisoner in an endless, horrific cycle. James had long given up on the idea of escaping. The realization that Monarch Heights was more than just a building, that it was a sentient, malevolent entity that fed on fear and trapped souls, had shattered his will. He had been claimed by the building, destined to join the ranks of its lost guards, doomed to relive his worst nightmares forever. The once ordinary corridors now felt like a suffocating labyrinth, each hallway an inescapable loop, pulling him deeper into the building's dark heart. But there was still a flicker of defiance inside him. Despite everything, despite the horror and the growing darkness that had enveloped his soul, James refused to surrender completely. He couldn't. He wouldn't. One last time, he resolved. He would try to escape. The ghosts of the other guards, the hollow-eyed, twisted remnants of the men who had come before him, watched from the corners of the darkened hallways, their vacant gazes following his every move. James ignored them. They were part of the building now, just as he was. But he refused to become like them, a shadow trapped in the walls, a forgotten part of this cursed place. He had to leave. He had to. His heart pounded in his chest as he rushed through the winding halls, his breath shallow, desperate. Every step felt like a battle. The walls seemed to close in around him, the air thick and oppressive, choking him with the weight of the building's power. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like a cacophony of voices all calling his name, beckoning him to join them in the darkness. "James." The whisper came from behind him, echoing through the narrow corridor. He spun around, but there was nothing, no one. Just the endless hallways stretching in all directions. He turned back to the front, the fear creeping up his spine like icy fingers, but he pushed forward. He reached the stairwell at the far end of the hallway. It was dimly lit, the staircase descending into shadows. He had passed this place dozens of times before, but tonight, something was different. The air felt heavier here, the temperature colder, like the building itself was trying to prevent him from moving forward. But James didn't care. He didn't have time to waste. He gripped the railing tightly and began to descend the stairs, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the walls. With every step, the building seemed to grow darker. The stairwell stretched on forever, like an endless descent into oblivion. His mind began to spiral, the pressure building as he fought to stay focused. The walls pulsed around him, and he swore he could hear the faint sound of laughter, low and mocking, echoing from somewhere far below. He reached the bottom of the stairs and found himself in a long, narrow hallway. At the far end there was a door, an exit, he hoped. The door was illuminated by a pale, flickering light, as if it were beckoning him. His pulse quickened as he ran toward it, his legs burning with exhaustion but his mind on fire with the need to escape. As he reached the door, he grasped the handle, his fingers trembling as he turned it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a darkened alleyway outside. It was almost too good to be true. The cold night air hit him like a slap in the face as he stepped out into the open air. But then, as the door swung fully open, something stopped him. A figure stood in the doorway, blocking his path. It was the manager. The ghostly figure was standing in the doorway, his face twisted in that same grotesque, malicious smile. His hollow eyes bore into James's soul, cold and unyielding. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" The manager's voice was a whisper, but it was everywhere. It seeped into James's bones, filling his mind with dread. James froze, the blood draining from his face. The exit, his last hope, was blocked by the very thing that had haunted him since the first night. The manager had found him just as he always did. "No, please," James whispered, his voice trembling. He was so close. He could almost feel the cool night air on his skin. He could almost taste freedom, but the manager was standing between him and that precious escape. "You can't leave," the manager hissed, his voice dripping with contempt. "Monarch Heights doesn't let its prisoners go. You are part of this place now, James. You belong here, just like the rest of us." James's hands shook as he gripped the doorframe, his heart racing. He had to get out. He had to escape, but the manager's figure loomed larger, like a wall that he couldn't break through. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch toward him, pulling him back into the building's grasp. "No," James gasped, struggling to find his voice. "I'm not staying. I won't be like them. I won't be trapped." The manager laughed, a low, cruel sound that reverberated through the walls. "You think you have a choice?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. "You don't. The building owns you now. It always owns you." James closed his eyes for a moment, a feeling of hopelessness creeping in. But then a new surge of adrenaline shot through him and he took a step forward, shoving the manager aside with all the strength he could muster. To his shock, the manager didn't move. He didn't block James's path. Instead, the figure faded into the shadows, dissolving like smoke in the wind. James's heart raced. The manager was gone. The door was open. The night was waiting for him. He stepped into the alleyway, his legs shaky but determined, and looked back at the looming silhouette of Monarch Heights. The building stood tall, an ever-watchful presence in the distance. But for the first time, James felt a fleeting sense of freedom. The night air was cold against his skin, but it felt like a breath of life, a breath he hadn't been able to take in days. He was free, or so he thought. But as he turned to walk into the night, he noticed something strange. The alleyway was empty, completely devoid of life. The city skyline, which had once been so familiar, now seemed distant, unreachable. The streets were silent, the lights faint and flickering. James paused, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind him, slow and deliberate. He turned, his breath catching in his throat, and there, at the end of the alley, was the manager, his hollow eyes gleaming in the darkness. "You can never escape," the manager whispered, his voice carrying the weight of eternity. James's body went numb, his vision blurring as the nightmare began again. The chill in the night air felt like a distant memory, replaced by the suffocating heat of Monarch Heights' relentless grip. James's heart raced in his chest, and his legs, heavy with exhaustion, moved like lead through the darkness of the alley. He turned back, every instinct in his body screaming at him to keep running. But when he looked over his shoulder, the alley had vanished. The city skyline was gone, swallowed up by the oppressive blackness of the building. The air was thick with dread. James felt like he was caught in a fog, unable to see the way forward, but acutely aware of the way he was being pulled back into the abyss. He spun around, desperate for an answer, but there was no answer. Only the looming shadow of Monarch Heights, its towering silhouette cutting into the dark sky like an ancient monument to terror. The manager's presence loomed over him, not just physically, but in his mind, twisting his thoughts, warping his sense of reality. James had barely taken a step before he heard the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. The manager's form appeared again, not as a shadow this time, but in full, terrifying clarity. His once smooth and polished face was now grotesque, drawn and unnaturally sharp. The hollowness in his eyes was infinite, like staring into a void that had no end. "You can never leave." The manager's voice was a whisper, but it vibrated with the force of 1,000 voices. "Monarch Heights owns you now, James. You are part of this building, forever." James staggered backward, his breathing ragged, his mind a blur of terror and disbelief. The once clear distinction between the outside world and the building seemed to collapse. The air around him felt like thick tar, choking his thoughts, wrapping them in a suffocating embrace. The building wasn't just a place anymore, it was a prison for his very soul. His every attempt to escape, every desperate plea for freedom had been in vain. The building's power was too strong. As he stood frozen in the alley, unable to move or speak, the truth settled on him like a heavy blanket. He was not leaving. Monarch Heights had claimed him, and there would be no escape. But then a strange, cold sense of acceptance washed over him. It wasn't that he had given up. It was that he had finally understood. He wasn't just another victim in a never-ending cycle of terror. He was now part of it. His name would be added to the list of those who had once been security guards, those whose souls were trapped in this place. And now, just as the others before him, he would wait. Wait for the next unsuspecting soul to walk through the doors of Monarch Heights, ready to claim them as part of the building's twisted legacy. With each passing second, the walls around him began to shift, the hallway stretching endlessly, the oppressive shadows closing in on him. The building had become his skin, its foundation his bones. There was no running, no place of safety. He had become one of them, the lost souls, forever caught in the labyrinth. The sound of footsteps grew louder, then softer, as if someone was walking behind him, approaching with deliberate slowness. James could feel the presence growing, as if it were being summoned. He turned, but this time there was no manager, no ghostly figure. Instead, the hallway was empty. At least it appeared to be. But as James stared deeper into the shadows, he saw it, another figure just beyond the reach of the flickering light. The shape was unmistakable. Another guard just like him, standing still, facing the walls of the hallway, waiting. James's heart skipped a beat. The figure was facing away from him, the details of its face obscured by darkness, but the uniform was clear. The guard's uniform was identical to James's. The same pale green fabric, the same name tag, the same stiff collar. The figure was him, or at least it was someone who looked just like him. It was as though the building had already created a new James, ready to take his place. A shiver ran down James's spine as the figure turned slowly, revealing its face. It was his face, aged, gaunt, and hollow. The eyes were empty, nothing but dark voids. The mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, lips cracked and dry. This was the fate James had feared, the fate he had tried so desperately to avoid, his own reflection, trapped in the body of a ghost. And just like that, it hit him. The cycle was complete. He had been replaced. And now it was his turn to become the Watcher. The figure, the new security guard, turned and walked down the hallway, its movements stiff and robotic. James's legs refused to move, as if they too had been taken by the building. He watched, helpless, as his doppelganger disappeared into the darkness, the sound of his footsteps echoing like a mocking reminder of what he had become. A new security guard had arrived at Monarch Heights, and just like all the others, he would never leave. As the camera zooms out, the cold, towering silhouette of Monarch Heights looms in the distance. The building stands as it always has, empty yet alive, feeding on the souls it has claimed, waiting for the next. And inside, James waits. The next soul to walk through the door would find their fate sealed, just as his had been. Monarch Heights had claimed him, and now he was part of its eternal haunting cycle. The building had won.